So, if you're unaware, Jews are vastly overrepresented in a number of industries and positions of authority in the United States, despite comprising less than 3% of the population. Now, there are plenty of videos and articles out there that highlight this fact better than I intend to, but to give you an idea, here are some things to consider. 3 out of 9 Supreme Court justices are Jewish, 8% of Congress is Jewish. There's also a number of past and present cabinet members with dual American-Israeli citizenship. This is an interesting fact in and of itself, because were it altered to reflect dual citizenship with Russia, it probably would have been a major media talking point ever since Donald Trump took office. Speaking of which, Jews are also very overrepresented in the ownership and management of all the major corporations that distribute American media. Jews also have a 1-to-1 ratio with whites in Ivy League university enrollment, and what's more is that most of these institutions are run by Jews. Recently, Asian American groups have filed a discrimination lawsuit against Harvard. The irony in this is that Jews used to complain about white Anglo-Saxon Protestants keeping them out. Now Jews are on the inside, and it's Asians who are complaining. Now, to explain their overrepresentation, Jordan Peterson highlights in a blog post that Ashkenazi Jews have a mean IQ of 115, and that Europeans have a mean IQ of 100, which is a full standard deviation lower. Because of how bell curve distributions work, this potentially reveals that 40% of Americans with IQs above 145 are Jewish, even though Jews are less than 3% of the population. This is Peterson's main argument, that Jewish overrepresentation is commensurate with the cognitive demand of any given field they're found in. As he points out, the numbers even neatly coincide with 40% of millionaires and billionaires being Jewish. This is a powerful argument on the surface, but it doesn't take into account the phenomenon of intellectual exclusion. The probability of entering and remaining in an intellectually elite profession such as physician, judge, professor, scientist, corporate executive, etc. increases with IQ to about 133. It then falls about a third by 140. By 150, the probability has fallen by 97%. In other words, a significant percentage of people with IQs over 140 are often excluded from what Peterson might call positions of authority, competence, and influence. Using the figures cited in Peterson's blog post, 2.1% of the white American population would score above 130, while 15.8% of Jewish Americans would. That's 4.2 million white Americans and 948,000 Jewish Americans with IQs greater than 130. Moreover, the 115 figure itself is somewhat problematic. That figure comes from studies of limited populations and from select private Jewish American schools. A more reasonable estimate of the Ashkenazi IQ might be about 110, although some people dispute that as well and propose something like 107, which is on par with some East Asian groups. Personally, I lean more toward the estimate of 110 cited in Richard Lynn's book on Jewish intelligence and achievement. This is still very high and quite meaningful, although, if anything, it somewhat leaves the overrepresentation of Jews even more unexplained. Now, many people are fixated on the fact that Israel has an IQ of 95, so before continuing, I would like to address this. Israel is made up of various Jewish ethnicities and a sizable Arab population, all of whom score differently on IQ. Taking this into account, a national IQ of 95 is actually quite plausible. Now, while Ethiopian Jews are in no way genetically related to the other Jewish ethnicities, generally speaking, Jews are an ethno-religious group with a DNA component. In fact, geneticists have been excited to study Jewish DNA precisely because over the course of their 3,000-plus year history, they've practiced a highly restrictive form of endogamy. As much as it may offend modern sensibilities, on a genetic basis it is entirely possible to be more or less Jewish than someone else, just as it is possible to be more or less Japanese, Nigerian, or German.
Until the mid-20th century, Jews throughout the world remained an incredibly insular group. Intermarriage averaged just 0.5%. And that very insularity has made Jews the perfect specimens for genetic research.
It's one of the few religions other than, let's say, Zoroastrianism, which is really a tribal religion still. It's beyond faith and culture. It's based on ancestry. It's a blood religion. Many Jews say with no contradiction, I'm an atheist Jew or an agnostic Jew. No other religion can make that claim.
Who's white exactly? Like, how do you draw these distinctions? Which is the problem, of course, the intersection left has run into.
So now that we're mostly on the same page in terms of Jewish intelligence, let's move on to Jordan Peterson's other assertions in his blog post. Referring to Jewish intellectuals, he asks, quote, "Is the fact that smart people are working hard for our mutual advancement really something to feel upset about?" Unquote. Well, Peterson himself has pointed out on more than one occasion that IQ is only a metric of how quickly a person can perform complex tasks. It's not a measure of kinship, in-group identity, altruism, or anything else. And yet Peterson ignores how ethnic groups of unequal intelligence have historically interacted with one another. For example, Europeans with a mean IQ of 100 were probably not working toward the mutual advancement of Africans with a mean IQ of 70 when they captured and enslaved them. The Bantu people, likewise, were not working toward the mutual advancement of the Pygmies when they captured and enslaved them. This is the overwhelming trend with virtually any set of ethnic groups of disparate intelligence, even ones situated within broader racial categories such as the Scots and the English. According to the Jewish Encyclopedia, by the 6th and 7th centuries, Jews had become the chief slave traders in Italy, and were also active in Gallic territories as well. By the 9th and 10th centuries, Jewish merchants, sometimes called Radhanites, were a major force in the trade throughout the entire continent. Now, Jews were certainly not the only players in this trade, but nonetheless, they were one of the few groups who could move freely between the Christian and Islamic worlds at the time. The 9th century Islamic scholar Ibn Cordoba observed and recorded routes of Jewish merchants from the south of France to Spain, and he noted the presence of female slaves, eunuch slaves, and young slave boys. He also noted Jews purchasing Slavic slaves in Prague. The Jewish population of Crimea was also a very important factor in the slave trade in that region during the 16th to 18th centuries. This was not an entirely small trade either, as some estimates record as many as 200,000 captives being brought to the area in the 16th century alone. In the 9th century, Louis the Fair is recorded to have granted charters to Jews visiting his kingdom, permitting them to possess and sell slaves, provided the latter had not been baptized. The Archbishop of Lyon claimed, however, that notwithstanding this provision, the Jews kept Christians as slaves regardless, citing the instance of a Christian refugee from Cordoba who declared that his co-religionists were frequently sold, as he had been, to the Muslim Moors. Following their expulsion from Spain and Portugal in the 1490s, many Sephardic Jews moved to Brazil and Suriname and held a number of large slave plantations there. According to Jewish author Herbert Bloom, quote, "The Christian inhabitants of Brazil were envious because the Jews owned some of the best plantations in the river valley of Pernambuco and were among the leading slaveholders and slave traders in the colony," unquote. Jewish historian Mark Lee Raphael wrote, quote, "Jews also took an active part in the Dutch colonial slave trade. Indeed, the bylaws of the Recife and Mauricia congregations included an imposta of 5 soldos for each Negro slave a Brazilian Jew purchased from the West Indies Company. Slave auctions were postponed if they fell on a Jewish holiday. In Curaçao in the 17th century, as well as in the British colonies of Barbados and Jamaica in the 18th century, Jewish merchants played a major role in the slave trade. In fact, in all the American colonies, whether French, British, or Dutch, Jewish merchants frequently dominated," unquote. In reference to the early period of the 18th century in the United States, the Jewish Encyclopedia also says that, quote, "The Jews of Georgia found the production of indigo, rice, corn, tobacco, and cotton more profitable. In fact, many of the cotton plantations in the South were wholly in the hands of the Jews, and as a consequence, slavery found its advocates among them," unquote. Jacob Rader Marcus, another Jewish historian, wrote that over 75% of Jewish families in Charleston, South Carolina, Richmond, Virginia, and Savannah, Georgia owned slaves, and nearly 40% of Jewish households across the country owned slaves. Granted, the Jewish population in the US at the time of slavery was very low, perhaps as low as 150,000 in 1860. Even so, the most liberal estimates of slave ownership in white households only gets up to about 25%, and conservative estimates are around 7%. Now, this doesn't mean that the number of slaves owned by Jews exceeded the number of slaves owned by whites, nor does it mean that Jews ran the entire Atlantic slave trade. What it means is that if you went back in time to 1860 and randomly selected a Jewish American and a white American, the Jewish American would be more likely to own slaves. In other words, Jews were overrepresented in slave ownership. The point here, though, is not to demonize them, but rather to highlight that simply because an ethnic group is highly intelligent, it doesn't necessarily follow that they will engage in altruistic behavior or work toward the mutual advancement of outgroups. Jordan Peterson supposedly detests identity politics, and yet, time and time again, he ignores the Jewish variety of them. In his blog post, he starts off by saying, quote, "The players of identity politics on the far right continue ever so pathologically to beat the anti-Semitic drum, pointing to the overrepresentation of Jews in positions of authority, competence, and influence, including revolutionary movements. I'm called upon, sometimes publicly, sometimes on social media platforms, to comment on such matters, and criticized when I hesitate to do so," unquote. Peterson then goes on to define identity politics. Quote, "If you're misguided enough to play identity politics, whether on the left or the right, then you require a victim and a perpetrator. Otherwise, you can't play the game. Once you determine to play, however, you benefit in a number of ways. You can claim responsibility for the accomplishments of your group you feel racially, ethnically akin to, without actually having to accomplish anything yourself. That's convenient. You can identify with the hypothetical victimization of that group and feel sorry for yourself and pleased at your compassion simultaneously. Another unearned victory. You simplify your world radically as well. All the problems you face now have a cause and a single one, so you can dispense with the unpleasant difficulty of thinking things through in detail. Bonus, furthermore, and most reprehensibly, you now have someone to hate, so your unrecognized resentment and cowardly and incompetent failure to deal with the world forthrightly can find a target, and you can feel morally superior in your consequent persecution," unquote. Well, do individual Jews identify with the victimization of people with whom they feel racially and ethnically akin? Do they not single out perpetrators to hate and to blame their problems on? Do Jewish individuals not claim responsibility for the accomplishments of other Jews without having done anything themselves?
There's something extraordinarily dangerous about having people revert to identification with their racial identity.
Jordan Peterson rails against identity politics, and yet he never comments on how 3 successive generations of German individuals have been obligated to pay out billions of dollars to Israel in reparations. This is not to say, however, that Germany didn't bear any responsibility for the atrocities they committed in World War II, but let's not kid ourselves. The German-Israeli reparations are based purely on multi-generational identity politics, and I fail to see how this doesn't violate Peterson's divine sovereignty of the individual.
Die Waffen haben Sie an Bord, nicht?
I don't speak Nazi.
Not only do many Jews play his detested brand of identity politics, but they also often do so by a different set of rules. For example, CNN recently fired Mark Lamont Hill for allegedly using coded anti-Semitic language, while Don Lemon, without suffering any consequence, repeatedly called white men in America the biggest terrorist threat and said that something needed to be done about them. The establishment today has also been very concerned with some Russian woman having joined the NRA and who apparently sought to establish unofficial channels of communication between Russia and Republican Party officials. Yet no one seems to recall that Israel has stolen sensitive US secrets before and has repeatedly sought to influence our elections and foreign policy. Jonathan Pollard, a Jewish American born in Texas, stole and handed over top secret US material to Israel in the mid-1980s. That material eventually fell into the hands of the Soviet Union. Pollard was caught, arrested, pled guilty to spying for Israel, and then was sentenced to life in prison. When asked why he did it, he said he felt a, quote, strong racial obligation to Israel. And over the last 33 years, Israel has reciprocated this obligation. They've made repeated attempts through official and unofficial channels to secure his release. They granted him Israeli citizenship in 1995, and in 2007, they even named a public square after him. Today, they're currently lobbying the Trump administration to pardon him and allow him to invoke his right of return to Israel. As an aside, this is evidence that neither Jews or Israelis have absolute control over the US government. If they did, Pollard would already have been released. Or perhaps he never would have been prosecuted. Or perhaps Israel wouldn't have needed his services to begin with. However, this doesn't negate the ethnocentric, self-serving result that Jews in positions of authority, competence, and influence may affect on foreign and domestic policy. In order to keep government jobs in an increasing number of states, today Americans must sign an agreement never to boycott Israel. In fact, some Texans couldn't even receive government aid after Hurricane Harvey unless they first signed said agreement. This wave of new American legislation comes in response to the international boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement working to pressure Israel to comply with international law regarding the treatment of Palestinians. Quite astonishingly, the very first Senate bill proposed in 2019 during the government shutdown was a bipartisan defense of the Israeli government from boycotts. The thing is, Americans already provide Israel with over $3 billion in annual grants. The American government has also just agreed to spend an additional $38 billion on Israel over the next 10 years. This is on top of the fact that Israel has been the largest cumulative recipient of American foreign aid since World War II. Meanwhile, Central American nations, whose citizens we're told have a human right to cross our borders freely because they're poor and destitute, receive a combined total of less than $500 million annually. This is truly remarkable. Not only do we indirectly pay impoverished, low IQ migrants to enter our country illegally, drive down wages, and disproportionately use welfare, but we also give the most aid to some of the smartest people on the planet, and then we let them turn around and bully our citizens into signing Orwellian legislation. If 40% of billionaires are indeed Jewish, then perhaps Israel should be lobbying them for financial support rather than the overwhelmingly non-Jewish American taxpayer who is living paycheck to paycheck. Now, returning to Peterson's blog post, he cites one of his own studies to explain that Jews lean more toward liberalism because of a correlation between the personality trait of openness and left-wing politics, and higher IQs, he argues, correlate with openness. He notes that the situation is more complex than this, but he still uses it as an explanation of aggregate Jewish political behavior. Kevin MacDonald, an evolutionary psychologist who has written extensively on this topic, responded to Peterson's claim. Quote, "In general, while there are significant correlations between IQ and openness, they do not explain much of the variance. For example, a paper co-authored by Peterson found a correlation of 0.30 between openness and G, and correlations ranging between 0.11 and 0.30 between G and the 6 facets of openness, with an average of 0.20. This means that at the high end, the correlation explains around 9% of the variance in openness. Among the facets, the range is between 1% and 9%, with an average of 4%. This means that knowing someone has a high IQ is a poor predictor that the person is also high on openness," unquote. I would furthermore highlight that while 75% of Jewish Americans voted Democrat in the 2018 midterms, over 90% of African Americans did as well, despite their mean IQ of 85. In fact, all minorities, regardless of their mean IQ, voted overwhelmingly Democrat in 2018. As the late Lee Kuan Yew once said, quote, "In multiracial societies, you don't vote in accordance with your economic interests and social interests. You vote in accordance with race and religion," unquote. Interestingly, Yew is from Singapore, the nation with the highest recorded mean IQ score of 108. In fact, most East Asian countries have a slightly higher mean IQ score than that of white European countries. Granted, it's not 10 to 15 points higher, but nevertheless, they don't appear to be very high on openness. Yes, China did adopt communism, but so did lower IQ populations in Latin America. Moreover, all East Asian countries, including China, are very ethnocentric, nationalistic, and do not like open borders. Coincidentally, Israel is also very ethnocentric, nationalistic, and does not like open borders. Sure, Israel's mean IQ is not 115, as we already discussed, but if we assume that only the highest IQ individuals in Israel are in positions of authority, competence, and influence, then how does one explain their nationalistic, right-wing policies? This gets to the heart of the matter. There need not be a tinfoil hat conspiracy with all Jews attending secret cabal meetings. Jews simply need to have ethnocentric and group preferences and aggregate behaviors that go against, or at least conflict with the interests of the majority host population. The fact that they're smarter might have some explanatory power in terms of where they end up in the economy, but it does little to assuage concerns. If they have distinct group-based interests, then they can use their higher IQs to undermine any opposition from a less intelligent majority. But in his blog post, Jordan Peterson more or less denies Jewish ethnocentrism altogether, and points to the recent work of Nathan Kofnas, who explains Jewish overrepresentation by what he calls the default hypothesis. Referring to the high concentration of Jews in cities such as Vienna, Paris, and New York, Kofnas says, quote, "These areas tended to have the infrastructure to support intellectual achievement. Indeed, even without postulating high Jewish IQ, From their location alone, we would expect them to be overrepresented in intellectual endeavors, unquote. Well, when any other ethnic group concentrates geographically, it's usually referred to as ethnocentric behavior, and I see no reason to refer to Jewish ethnocentrism as something else simply because it's Jewish. Perhaps their high intelligence explains the initial attraction to these areas, but it does not explain their continued group cohesion afterwards. The rationale behind geographic advantage reminds me of something former ADL chairman Abe Foxman once told Jewish journalist Joel Stein in the LA Times. He said that the phrase "Jews control Hollywood" was dangerous. Instead of control, Foxman would prefer people say that many executives in the industry happen to be Jewish, as in, all 8 major film studios are run by men who happen to be Jewish. Stein's response was telling, quote, "Maybe my life spent in a pro-Semitic cocoon has left me naive, but I don't care if Americans think we're running the news media, Hollywood, Wall Street, or the government. I just care that we get to keep running them," unquote. This is fascinating, not because he wants Jews to keep running America, but rather because he others Americans out of his Jewish in-group. But let's return to the argument of geographic advantage. In 2014, Swedish professor Jan Biro wrote an interesting paper about the Jewish bias in Nobel Prizes. Now, he doesn't address geographic advantage directly, but on page 7 he says, quote, "Another plausible explanation for the J-bias is that a larger proportion of the Jewish than the Gentile population of a Gentile society is engaged in intellectual activity. The 26-time J-bias in America would therefore imply that 26 times more Jews than other Americans choose science as a profession. There are about 2.1 million scientists in the USA, representing 0.6 of Americans. Of the 6 million American Jews, 0.6% is 36,000, which would mean that 26 times 36,000 equals 1,044,000 Jews are scientists, i.e. every 6th Jew in the USA. This is a highly unlikely number," unquote. Now, these data, I would argue, are presented in a way that is not without problems. However, if we accept that the average IQ of a Nobel laureate is around 145 and above, then according to Jordan Peterson's own formula, there are only about 138,000 Jewish Americans within that range. Those 138,000 people have to account not only for the 26-fold overrepresentation of Nobel laureates, but all of Peterson's individuals in positions of authority, competence, and influence. As Jan Biro stated, it's much more likely that an extensive and well-organized personal networking of a marketing type among Jewish scientists, together with the egalitarian, liberal, nonchalant attitude of the Swedish representatives of the donor, are responsible for this unfortunate phenomenon. Another interesting point that Nathan Kofnas makes in his paper is that, quote, 20th century anti-Semitic nationalist movements were generally not welcoming of ethnic Jews regardless of their desire to assimilate, and even if they were, it seems unreasonable to question a Jew's desire to reject Judaism because he did not want to kill, expel, or oppress his probably still Jewish family and former friends, unquote. Well, while Jews were definitely persecuted by Europeans throughout history, there were plenty of times when Europeans demanded that Jews assimilate. In fact, Jews were often persecuted precisely because they refused to assimilate. For example, in 1827, Tsar Nicholas I abolished the custom of allowing Jewish males to pay a special tax in order to avoid military conscription. Later, in 1844, he abolished the institution of the Kahal, which was a system of autonomous governments granted to Ashkenazi Jews in European societies. In that same year, he also enacted a law prohibiting the traditional Jewish garb, specifying that all Jews should, except on ceremonial occasions, dress in conformity with Russian standards. These measures were implemented with the express aim of assimilating the Russian Jewry into greater Russian society. Now, that's not a justification for peasant-led pogroms against Jews, but Kofnas should at least acknowledge that for over 2,000 years, Jews had explicitly wanted to remain separate from Gentiles, both genetically and religiously. Moreover, Kofnas considers it unreasonable to expect a Jew to turn on his fellow Jews, yet I imagine he would not extend this same consideration to Europeans. A man of European descent who puts his fellow Europeans above others is widely considered a supremacist. This plays into Kevin MacDonald's analysis of the contrast between Middle Old World pastoralist cultures and Northern hunter-gatherer cultures. Middle Eastern peoples, he argues, are predisposed to a kind of moral particularism, wherein something is viewed as good only if it benefits the in-group. Northern Europeans, on the other hand, are predisposed to a kind of moral universalism, wherein good is viewed as good regardless. In other words, Europeans lean toward egalitarianism and individualism, whereas Jews lean toward ethnocentrism and collectivism. As MacDonald writes, quote, "Whereas individualist cultures are biased toward separation from the wider group, individuals in collectivist societies have a strong sense of group identity and group boundaries based on genetic relatedness as a result of the greater importance of group conflict during their evolutionary history. Middle Eastern societies are characterized by anthropologists as segmentary societies, organized into relatively impermeable kinship-based groups. Individualist societies are therefore an ideal environment for Judaism as a highly collectivist group-oriented strategy. Jews benefit from open individualistic societies in which barriers to upward mobility are removed, in which people are viewed as individuals rather than as members of groups, in which intellectual discourse is not prescribed by institutions like the Catholic Church that are not dominated by Jews, and in which mechanisms of altruistic punishment may be exploited to divide the European majority. This is also why, apart from periods in which Jews served as middlemen between alien elites and native populations, Middle Eastern societies were much more efficient than Western individualistic societies at keeping Jews in a powerless position, where they did not pose a competitive threat." Unquote. These observations are tragic because, if true, they could explain all the pluralist thought of the last 50 years. For example, that race is a social construct, but affirmative action and non-white racial solidarity groups are needed to combat the solidarity of whites. As a result, white people have grown frustrated and confused as it becomes increasingly clear that they alone are to be singled out and that no one else is willing to give up their ethnic identity, at least not the Jews, who are disproportionately attacking white identity wherever they can find it. For example, the other day Tim Wise tweeted out this, quote, "Private clubs have the right to exclude on the basis of race, but when they do, it makes them assholes. Oh, and racists. They should be shamed and shunned." Unquote. Later on, in regards to a missionary being killed by an uncontacted tribe, he tweeted out this, quote, "Sad he was killed, but maybe stop trying to spread the word of the Lord in places that didn't invite you in. Their right to be left alone outweighs your need to be God's little messenger boy." Unquote. The contradiction here should be entirely self-evident, but to put this into focus, virtually no one today believes that Europeans were entitled to dictate to Africans how to live during colonialism. Even if, on average, Europeans have a higher IQ, Africans still rejected foreign influence and didn't consider white men to be the best suited for the positions of authority, competence, and influence in their societies. They wanted to be left alone. This brings me back to Jordan Peterson's earlier question. Is the fact that smart people are working hard for our mutual advancement really something to feel upset about? Well, do low IQ minorities in America accept that comparatively high IQ white men are working toward their mutual advancement? No, they do not. And yet Peterson never uses the high IQ argument to defend white overrepresentation relative to black and Hispanic underrepresentation. In fact, the only aggregate group differences he seems willing to acknowledge are Jewish-Gentile. Well, that's convenient.
Race is a very difficult thing to define because racial boundaries aren't tight, right? So when you talk about racial differences in IQ, you're faced with the thorny problem of defining race. Jews are overrepresented in positions of power and authority. But then, let's open our eyes a little bit, eh? And think for like 2 or 3 seconds and think, hey, guess what? They're also overrepresented in positions of competence. And it's not like we have more geniuses than we know what to do with. And if the Jews happen to be producing more of them, which they are, by the way, then that's a pretty good thing for the rest of us.
Jewish Americans have behaved as an ethnocentric bloc in American society, and white Americans have every right to reject this, just as Africans had a right to reject colonialism, regardless of how anyone may qualify either influence. Now, Nathan Kofnas does highlight in his paper that since World War II, the Jewish American rate of intermarriage has risen to about 50%. For Kofnas, this is evidence of a lack of Jewish ethnocentrism. It's certainly worth consideration, but it's also highly anomalous in the 3,000-year history of the Jewish people, and unsurprisingly, many Jewish individuals and groups are concerned about this miscegenation, although they're very careful to avoid calling it that. Meanwhile, Christianity and Catholicism are on the decline, and the white birth rate is below replacement levels, and yet any mention of this is often interpreted by Jewish Americans as white fragility or aggrieved whiteness. A recent study conducted disproportionately by Jewish Americans at Cornell University seeks to promote more diverse pairings on the dating sites. Specifically, it targets the white preference for whites as a problem that needs to be addressed. Quote, OkCupid, for instance, ran a series of experiments in which users were unwittingly presented with bad matches according to the site's algorithms, but told that they were highly compatible. The site found that the power of suggestion had a real effect on user behavior. Users who were predicted to be incompatible had more successful interactions when they were told by the platform that they were compatible, unquote. OkCupid claims that these short-term interactions were more positive as a result of misleading users. And perhaps that's true, but to quote Ben Shapiro,
if you have to lie to get somebody to identify with your conclusion, then you are not only doing it wrong, you are doing something immoral itself.
The study goes on, though, to note that, quote, heterosexual women of all races prefer white over non-white partners. This highlights an interesting emergent pattern in mainstream thought today. The cognitive free market should be left alone when Jews are on top of it, but the sexual marketplace needs to be heavily regulated when whites are on top of it. Honestly, I wouldn't be shocked if a Marxist argument emerged one day claiming that European genes needed to be redistributed. Now, perhaps that's hyperbole, but what's not hyperbole is that the study's authors felt that Jews should be exempt from being coerced into diverse pairings. Quote, while it may strike us as normatively acceptable to encourage intimate platform users to be open to more diverse potential partners, we might find some categories more palatable for such intervention than others. For example, it might seem inappropriate to suggest that a Jewish user seeking other Jewish people expand her horizons past those preferences, which might be based on a number of religious and cultural considerations, unquote. But why should Jews be exempt from this? Surely, if whites can benefit from the power of suggestion, Israeli Jews could benefit from it as well. Perhaps Cornell University should be exploring ways to encourage Israeli Jews to date Palestinian Arabs. Coincidentally, the very notion of race as a social construct was an early 20th century invention of Jewish intellectuals, who slowly took over American academia. Jewish-American sociologist Irving Lewis Horowitz wrote in his book The Decomposition of Sociology that sociology departments became populated by Jews to such an extent that jokes began to abound. Quote, one did not need the synagogue. The minyan was to be found in sociology departments. Or one did not need a sociology of Jewish life since the two had become synonymous, unquote. Franz Boas, a Jewish immigrant to the US in the late 1800s, is largely considered the father of modern anthropology and cultural relativism, along with his mostly Jewish disciples. He was an avid socialist who strongly criticized what has come to be known as scientific racism. However, until around the 1910s, he mostly agreed with the scientific consensus of that time. In a speech he gave in 1894 under the title Human Faculty as Determined by Race, he said some of the following, quote, we have shown that the anatomical evidence is such that we may expect to find the races not equally gifted. While we have no right to consider one more ape-like than the other, the differences are such that some have probably greater mental vigor than others. The variations are, however, such that we may expect many individuals of all races to be equally gifted, while the number of men and women of higher ability will differ, unquote. Later on, he commented specifically on cranial capacity. Quote, we find that 50% of all whites have a capacity of the skull greater than 1,550 cc's, while 27% of the Negroes and 32% of the Melanesians have capacities above this value. We might therefore anticipate a lack of men of high genius, but should not anticipate any great lack of faculty among the great mass of Negroes living among whites and enjoying the advantages of the leadership of the best men of that race, unquote. Now, while Boas' opinion was nuanced, he did acknowledge the average differences in cranial capacity. Yet paradoxically, today he's famous for a particular paper that he wrote in 1912, in which he analyzed skull measurements from over 13,000 subjects. He claimed that environment determined skull shape, not heredity, and that no one could use skull shape to reliably distinguish ethnicity or race. Bolder still, he further insinuated that the unique American environment was working to mold immigrants into a new phenological type. For almost a century, Boas' work had been widely accepted, but in 2002, it came under question. Corey Sparks, a doctoral candidate at Penn State, and Richard Yantz, a professor at the University of Tennessee, reviewed Boas' study on human skulls. They found that Boas failed to account for the fact that the cranium changes during childhood development, and that once age is factored out, the amount of change in the original measurements is not statistically significant. In fact, the reanalysis of Boas' measurements indicated an overall stability of the cranial index, And a later study by Yance asserted that Boas even cherry-picked among groups of immigrants who had varied most towards the same mean, and discarded other groups who had varied in the opposite direction. What some people suspect today is that Boas and his followers started placing their political ideologies above science. Many of the changes in his work correlate to immigration debates and the rise of National Socialism in Germany. Boas was, by many accounts, a man heavily influenced by his Jewish identity. At one point, Alfred Kreubert recalls him saying, quote, "If we Jews had to choose to work only with Gentiles certified to be 100% free of anti-Semitism, who could we ever really work with?" Unquote. Ashley Montague, his protege, once echoed the same sentiment. Quote, "If you are brought up a Jew, you know that all non-Jews are anti-Semitic." Unquote. All throughout the 20th century, other Jewish anthropologists have continued to rail against Darwinian thinking in human biology. Stephen Jay Gould was well known for his book, The Mismeasure of Man, in which he asserted that 19th century craniologist Samuel George Morton had, because of an unconscious bias, selectively reported data in mismeasured skulls in order to support his prejudicial views on intelligence differences between different populations. In a later study, however, entitled The Mismeasure of Science, Stephen Jay Gould versus Samuel George Morton on Skulls and Bias, authored by 6 anthropologists, it was concluded that the bias actually came from Gould, who, incidentally, was raised by a Marxist father and was an avid political activist. Jared Diamond is the famous Jewish author of the book Guns, Germs, and Steel, in which he posits why Eurasian peoples conquered or displaced Native Americans, Australians, and Africans. He argues against any biological advantages unique to Eurasians, and instead points to the features of the Eurasian continent, such as its high diversity of wild plant and animal species suitable for domestication, and its east-west major axis that favored the spread of those domesticates, people, and technologies for long distances with little change in latitude. Now, Diamond certainly made some valid observations, as did Boas, but he also omitted things like the strong correlation between latitude and IQ. At or close to the equator, the average IQ is 69, whereas at a latitude of 54 degrees, the average is 98. Despite this, Diamond essentially argues that you could select and test at random African pygmies and the Japanese, and no patterns in cognitive ability or personality would form. Even now, as more and more data confirm the biological reality of racial and ethnic differences, some Jewish geneticists are still trying to spin the narrative. David Reich, in an opinion piece in the New York Times, said, quote, "My laboratory discovered in 2016, based on our sequencing of ancient human genomes, that whites are not derived from a population that existed from time immemorial, as some people believe. Instead, whites represent a mixture of 4 ancient populations that lived 10,000 years ago, and were each as different from one another as Europeans and East Asians are today." Unquote. The insinuation here that in order for white to be a meaningful category of identity, white people need to have existed since time immemorial and be entirely pure is absurd because it requires a set of criteria that literally no species or subspecies can meet. Interestingly, Ashkenazi Jews have only existed as a distinct genetic group for about 1/5 of the time that Europeans have. Yet they're one of the most safeguarded and cherished peoples on the planet, and folks like Jordan Peterson have no issue identifying them as a unique population with aggregate cognitive abilities that differ from those of other populations. All throughout David Reich's book, Who We Are and How We Got Here, he rails against the notion of purity, while he repeatedly uses the semantically equivalent term unmixed to refer to ghost populations that gave rise to the various groups scattered about the globe today. Essentially, Reich tries to dismiss the spirit of race realism on an autistic technicality. The question today is not whether or not Africans, Europeans, Asians, etc. are different species, it's whether or not we are genetically distinct, and whether or not these distinctions are meaningful, insofar that they've contributed to the traditions and values our respective groups have cultivated over time. While Reich acknowledges non-trivial differences between populations, for example in predisposition to diseases, he mostly dismisses the notion of meaningful aggregate differences in cognition and physical ability. He says, for example, that, quote, "For most traits, hard work and the right environment are sufficient to allow someone with a lower genetically predicted performance at some task to excel compared to people with a higher genetically predicted performance," unquote. Now, without a doubt, the African pygmies should be treated with every bit of dignity and respect that all human beings deserve. But the pygmy IQ bell curve is so far removed from that of Ashkenazi Jews that it's irresponsible to keep pretending that their population can produce someone of the intellectual caliber of David Reich, who is likely 7 standard deviations above their average intelligence. Again, the work of David Reich in his laboratory is not without merit, but he often insinuates an agenda. Quote, "To understand the power of the genome revolution for undermining old stereotypes about identity and building up a new basis for identity, consider how its finding of repeated mixture in human history has destroyed nearly every argument that used to be made for biologically based nationalism." Unquote. On one hand, Reich recognizes that despite the genetic diversity of ancient populations, Europe has become genetically homogeneous over thousands of years, and yet he feels compelled to say things like this, quote, "The findings of the ancient DNA revolution suggest that the mixtures will continue. Mixture is fundamental to who we are, and we need to embrace it, not deny that it occurred." Unquote. Interestingly, Reich also highlights in his book that during ancient migrations, foreign men bred with local females to the exclusion of local males, and yet he naively ignores the lesson to be drawn from this, which is that women are often hypergamous to dominant men of outgroups, and even when they aren't, the invaders simply rape them. Never has there been a mass migration in human history that was marked by equality of social and sexual outcome. Speaking on the genetic legacy of conquest, Reich says that evidence of the antiquity of inequality should motivate us to deal in a more sophisticated way with it today. But what does that even mean? That academics and intellectuals need to encourage an equal number of men and women to breed with outgroups? Moreover, Reich's stance is essentially that because once upon a time Europe was not as homogeneous as it is today, there's no argument for biologically based nationalism. He also often brings up his Jewish heritage. Quote, "I went for 9 years to a Jewish school and spent many summers in Jerusalem. From my parents as well as from my grandparents and cousins, I imbibed a strong sense of difference, a feeling that our group was special, and a knowledge that I would cause disappointment and embarrassment if I married someone non-Jewish." Unquote. Now, Reich is self-admittedly not a religious person. However, what's interesting is that he tries to insinuate that Judaism was a kind of proto-universalist perspective toward all of humanity. Quote, "After reading the Passover story, Jews intuitively understand how within their population, numbering millions of people, they are related to each other in the past. The story allows Jews to think of those millions of co-religionists as direct relations, and to treat them with equal respect and seriousness even if they do not understand their exact relationships. To break out from the trap of thinking of the world from the perspective of the relatively small families we were raised in." Unquote. This is ludicrous. Judaism was not breaking out from any kind of trap. The ancient Israelites slaughtered entire rival groups in the Levant, and they forbade intermarriage with them. The very concept of Judaism is ethno-religious nationalism. Coincidentally, despite his strong feelings about embracing admixture, David Reich married a fellow Ashkenazi Jew. Now, while I highly appreciate much of the work on ancient human DNA that David Reich has done, I fear that he's been using his findings to further delegitimize national sovereignty and to undermine the natural human desire to protect one's ethnic, cultural, and genetic identity. Reich's work is conveniently being published and promoted at a time when there is a tyrannical push for massive third world migration into Europe and European-derived nations, and he does virtually nothing to distinguish between the ancient peoples of the Russian steppe invading Europe over thousands of years and massive amounts of equatorial peoples coming to Western nations in the span of half a century. Seemingly in stark contrast to the Jewish propensity during the 20th century to deny the existence of race, in 1941, an American Jew, Theodore N. Kaufman, called for the systematic extermination of Germans in his book, Germany Must Perish. Quote, "Since Germans are the perennial disturbers of the world's peace, they must be dealt with like any homicidal criminals. But it is unnecessary to put the whole German nation to the sword. It is more humane to sterilize them. The army groups, as organized units, would be the easiest and quickest to deal with. The population of Germany, excluding conquered and annexed territories, is about 70 million, almost equally divided between male and female. To achieve the purpose of German extinction, it would be necessary to only sterilize some 48 million, a figure which excludes, because of their limited power to procreate, males over 60 years of age and females over 45. Taking 20,000 surgeons as an arbitrary number and on the assumption that each will perform a minimum of 25 operations daily, it would take no more than 1 month, at the maximum, to complete their sterilization. The balance of the male civilian population of Germany could be treated within 3 months. Inasmuch as sterilization of women needs somewhat more time, it may be computed that the entire female population of Germany could be sterilized within a period of 3 years or less. Complete sterilization of both sexes, and not only one, is to be considered necessary in view of the present German doctrine that so much as 1 drop of true German blood constitutes a German. Of course, after complete sterilization, there will cease to be a birth rate in Germany. At the normal death rate of 2% per annum, German life will diminish at the rate of 1,500,000 yearly. Accordingly, in the span of 2 generations, that which cost millions of lives and centuries of useless effort, namely the elimination of Germanism and its carriers, will have been an accomplished fact. By virtue of its loss of self-perpetuation, German will have atrophied and German power reduced to negligible importance." Unquote. Kaufman's book was mentioned and advertised in a number of American newspapers, and unsurprisingly, it flipped out the National Socialists in Germany, who promoted it as part of an international Jewish conspiracy to wipe out ethnic Germans. Many would consider the German response paranoid and opportunistic. However, in 1921, David Francis, the American ambassador to Russia, reported that, quote, "The Bolshevik leaders here, most of whom are Jews and 90% of whom are returned exiles, care little for Russia or any other country, but are internationalists, and they are trying to start a worldwide social revolution." Unquote. Moreover, according to published statistics in 1934, the Soviet Union leadership was over 38.5% ethnically Jewish, and this same regime had intentionally starved 6 to 7 million Ukrainians between 1932 and 1933, with Jewish men like Lazar Kaganovich being largely responsible. As one communist leader said regarding the Ukrainian genocide, quote, "Famine in the Ukraine was brought on to decrease the number of Ukrainians, replace the dead with people from other parts of the USSR, and thereby to kill the slightest thought of any Ukrainian independence." Unquote. As controversial as it may be for me to say, perhaps the German concerns in 1941 weren't entirely unreasonable given past and contemporary events. In the September 26, 1941 issue of the Canadian Jewish Chronicle, Kaufman further defended his plan for the sterilization of all Germans, saying, quote, "I believe that the Jews have a mission in life. They must see to it that the nations of the world get together in one vast federation. Union now is the beginning of this. Slowly but surely, the world will develop into a paradise. We will have perpetual peace, and the Jews will do the most to bring about this confederation because they have the most to gain."
It's a huge transformation for Europe to make. They are now going into a multicultural mode, and Jews will be resented because of our leading role.
למה זה מאיים שיהיו פה מיליון אפריקאים?
זה מאיים כי לא תהיה פה מדינה יהודית.
In 1943, a similar but less direct plan advocated by a Jewish anthropologist at Harvard University, no less, Ernest Houghton, had the aim to, quote, "encourage also the immigration and settlement in the German states of non-German nationals, especially males. The objects of this measure include reduction of the birth rate of pure Germans, neutralization of German aggressiveness by outbreeding, and denationalization of indoctrinated individuals." Unquote. In blatant contradiction, however, Houghton had previously written in 1936 that, quote, "each racial type runs the gamut from idiots and criminals to geniuses and statesmen. No type produces a majority of individuals from either end of the scale. While there may be specific racial abilities and disabilities, these have not yet been demonstrated. There are no racial monopolies, either of human virtues or of vices." Unquote. People might be tempted to assert here that the ideas of Houghton and Kaufman were not widely known at the time, but they were, and they had real-world consequences. For example, German authorities cited Kaufman when they deported the Jews from Hanover in 1941. Moreover, these men were not alone in many of their sentiments. A kind of intellectual predecessor to Houghton and Kaufman was Richard von Coudenhove-Kalergi, a 20th century Austrian-Japanese aristocrat. His work Practical Idealism, published in 1924, placed the racially inbred rustic man at odds with the racially hybrid urban man. Kalergi considered the future of humanity to be one of mixed race, with Jews comprising the base of its aristocracy. Although not Jewish himself, one could argue that he was a Jewish supremacist. He writes, quote, "Judaism is the new nobility, but Judaism is the womb, from which a new spiritual nobility of Europe is made. the core around which a new spiritual nobility, an intellectual and urban master race is in education. Idealists, witty and finely tuned, just and full of conviction, as loyal and brave as the feudal nobility in its best days. They bear death and persecution, hatred and contempt happily in order to make mankind moral, spiritual, and happy. The Jewish heroes and martyrs of the Eastern and Central European Revolution are the equal of the non-Jewish heroes of the World War and are superior in courage, perseverance, and idealism. The essence of these men and women who try to redeem and regenerate mankind is a peculiar synthesis of religious and political elements, of heroic martyrdom and spiritual propaganda, revolutionary energy and social love, of justice and compassion. These traits, which once created the Christian world movement, are the superior goal of the socialist movement. The Jews of the inherited masses of Europe have been more richly gifted in spiritual salvation and morality than any other nation. Modern Judaism exceeds all other nations in its percentages of great men. Scarcely 1 century after its liberation, this small people stands today with Einstein at the forefront of modern science, with Mahler at the front of modern music, with Bergson at the forefront of modern philosophy, with Trotsky at the top of modern politics." Unquote. Now, I've heard some people argue that because Kalergi was one of the first to advocate pan-Europeanism, that this made him pro-European, but in none of his writings did he champion indigenous Europeans. While he certainly valued aspects of their culture, he didn't view them as being a necessary component for the continuation of Western civilization, which he viewed more or less as a product of Judaism. Indeed, the entire segment of practical idealism that compares and contrasts paganism with Christianity is essentially a proxy for barbarous Northern Europeans versus noble Jews. Moving on, it can be argued that during the post-war period between 1945 and 1948, some of the sentiments of Houghton and Kaufman were actually put into practice by the Morgenthau Plan. Officially designed by the U.S. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau as a means of demilitarizing and deindustrializing Germany after World War II, the plan had the stated aim of ensuring that Germany could never again wage war. Detractors, however, criticized it, saying that it would cause mass starvation and economic chaos. While the plan was never fully implemented on its own, much of it was incorporated into the JCS 1067 directive that was official policy between 1945 and 1948. And just as the critics feared, the plan caused mass starvation and economic chaos. Perhaps as many as 3 million Germans died in this period from starvation and disease. German soldiers were rounded up and put into the very same concentration camps that previously housed Germany's political prisoners. Civilians who tried to feed them were threatened with being shot. Food stores were left to rot or destroyed, while infant mortality rates soared as a result of malnutrition. The Allies even went as far as to reclassify German soldiers as disarmed enemy combatants in order to circumvent stipulations outlined in the Geneva Conventions. It turns out that Morgenthau's assistant, Harry Dexter White, was not only the main author of the Morgenthau Plan, but he was also a Jewish-American spy for the Soviet Union. In fact, I was quite shocked to find out that there were several Soviet spies in the Treasury Department at the time, and yes, they were also Jewish. According to Jewish author Nathan Glazer, in the 1960s and 1970s, Jews comprised half of all the active communists in the United States, and 4 out of 5 of its communist leaders. Also, coincidentally, most of the individuals in the Rosenberg spy network of the 1950s were Jewish. Now, the correlation between Judaism and communism is well established and well documented. Now, this is not a claim that every single Jew is a communist, nor is this a dog whistle to incite some kind of nefarious action against Jews, but Jordan Peterson's willingness to attribute their overrepresentation in communism to high IQ and openness seems absurd. Even if, by some strange quirk in evolution, all people with IQs above 145, regardless of ethnic background, lean toward creating and propagating revolutionary movements that end up killing 100 million people within the span of 75 years, then I will have to disagree with Jordan Peterson. These people are not working toward our mutual advancement, and there is something to feel upset about. Moreover, if you take a look at Western nations today, there is a clear correlation between these older anti-German ideas of the 20s, 30s, and 40s and the anti-white mass migration policies of today. Following the end of World War II and coinciding with the decline in Darwinist anthropological thinking in academia, there was an increased push to change immigration laws in the United States and most other majority white nations. Until Jewish Congressman Emanuel Seller introduced his 1965 Immigration Act, America had always aimed to maintain a Nordic European supermajority. The 1965 Immigration Act was mostly the culmination of a 40-year effort by the Jewish community to overturn the 1924 Immigration Act, which Emanuel Seller strongly opposed, presumably because it established quotas for Eastern European Jews. When one of Franz Boas' disciples, Margaret Mead, testified before the President's Commission on Immigration and Naturalization in 1953, she said, quote, "All human beings from all groups of people have the same potentialities. Our best anthropological evidence today suggests that people of every group have about the same distribution of potentialities," unquote. When 1965 finally came around, Jewish Senator Jacob Javits, during the debate on the 65 immigration bill, said, quote, "Both the dictates of our conscience as well as the precepts of sociologists tell us that immigration, as it exists in the national origins quota system, is wrong and without any basis in reason or fact, for we know better than to say that one man is better than another because of the color of his skin," unquote. Charles Silberman explains why American Jews sought these policies in his 1985 book, A Certain People, American Jews and Their Lives Today. Quote, "American Jews are committed to cultural tolerance because of their belief, one firmly rooted in history, that Jews are safe only in a society acceptant of a wide range of attitudes and behaviors, as well as a diversity of religious and ethnic groups. It is this belief, for example, not approval of homosexuality, that leads an overwhelming majority of US Jews to endorse gay rights, and to take a liberal stance on most other so-called social issues," unquote. In 1993, Earl Yaub, a Jewish author and 35-year member of the ADL, said, quote, "The Census Bureau has just reported that about half of the American population will soon be non-white or non-European, and they will all be American citizens. We have tipped beyond the point where a Nazi Aryan party will be able to prevail in this country. We have been nourishing the American climate of opposition to bigotry for about a century. That climate has not yet been perfected, but the heterogeneous nature of our population tends to make it irreversible and makes our constitutional constraints against bigotry more practical than ever," unquote. Stuart Svanken in 1997 wrote in his work, Jews Against Prejudice, American Jews in the Fight for Civil Liberties, that, quote, "The primary objective of the Jewish intergroup relations agencies after 1945 was to prevent the emergence of an anti-Semitic reactionary mass movement in the United States," unquote. Jordan Peterson and Nathan Kofnas claim that Jews are only overrepresented in positions where a high IQ is a requisite. Yet, out of almost 6 million Jewish Americans, only about 10,000 are serving on active duty in the military. Now, does the US military not need high IQ individuals? This is not meant to shame Jewish Americans, but it does undermine the notion that IQ explains all aggregate ethnic behavior. It's true that in the past, Jewish Americans served at much higher rates, but that was before the creation of a Jewish ethno-state in the Middle East, where coincidentally all Jewish citizens are required to serve in the Israeli military for at least 2 years. I would also like to ask Peterson, why are Jews overrepresented in pornography? Does it take significant cognitive advantage to promote underage sex with minors, miscegenation, incest, rape, cuckoldry, or infidelity? Pornography is a massive industry that has a massive impact on the psyche of American youth. And on that note, Nathan Abrams, a Jewish professor, wrote in his 2004 paper, Triple Xnix, that in the post-war era, America's most notorious pornographer was Reuben Sturman, the Walt Disney of porn. According to the US Department of Justice, throughout the 1970s, Sturman controlled most of the pornography circulating in the country. Abrams continues, stating that Jewish involvement in the X-rated industry can be seen as a proverbial 2 fingers to the entire white Anglo-Saxon Protestant establishment in America. He also quotes Al Goldstein, founder of Screw magazine, having said that the only reason that Jews are in pornography is that we think that Christ sucks. Catholicism sucks. We don't believe in authoritarianism. Abrams also notes that those at the forefront of the movement which forced America to adopt a more liberal view of sex were Jewish, and that Jews were also at the vanguard of the sexual revolution of the 1960s. Wilhelm Reich, Herbert Marcuse, and Paul Goodman replaced Marx, Trotsky, and Lenin as required revolutionary reading. Now, I don't think that Al Goldstein or Reuben Sturman necessarily had direct ties to guys like George Soros or Michael Bloomberg. It could just be that their individual behaviors came from a common ethnic source. Again, there need not be secret cabal meetings with every single Jew in attendance for this to be worth addressing. If a relatively small but elite class of Jews is consistently using their resources and intelligence to promote an outcome that is harmful to Europeans and people of European descent, then their behavior is a problem, and we can have a reasonable discussion about whether or not their Jewish heritage motivates them. The common accusation thrown at anti-Semites is that they're simply jealous of Jewish success and are blaming their problems on Jews, much in the same way that blacks blame their problems on whites. Now, while the Jew-Gentile situation does have some parallels to the black-white situation, there are important distinctions. The core concern here is not that white Gentiles are underperforming relative to Ashkenazi Jews. East Asian Americans, for example, comprise a similar subpopulation in terms of intelligence, size, and relative economic success. Yet there isn't a very strong anti-Sino movement, and the aggregate behavior of Sino-Americans isn't very aggressive toward white Americans, despite the fact that white Americans put the Japanese into internment camps and dropped 2 atomic bombs on their homeland. Jewish Americans do not want to address this. For them, anti-Semitism is simply an irrational, metaphysical phenomenon with absolutely no Jewish contribution. This refusal to take any responsibility was reflected in a Kotaku article about BioShock, wherein the game's lead writer, Ken Levine, revealed just how thematically Jewish the game actually is. Quote, "Rapture, like Israel, is a response to oppression. It's a response to a fear of future oppression. Ryan sees threats to his kind, and his solution is a radical one. It's an extremely radical one, but it's not that different than starting a state in the Middle East. It's a radical solution to a radical problem," unquote. At times, the article insinuates that the violence and trauma taking place in and around Israel and Palestine is itself a byproduct of historical oppression against Jews. Quote, "Like any good alternate history, BioShock poses a what-if question that has the potential to become a what-is statement. Out of fear of future oppression, Ryan and his followers essentially recreate the conditions for further violence, trauma, and pain. That should sound familiar to anyone who keeps up with current events. An idealized homeland for a displaced people that is founded with the best of intentions and worst of fears," unquote. The author goes on to describe the motivations behind Ryan and his Jewish cronies. Quote, "Ryan's philosophy is based in part on the idea that there are great men of history, the very same ones that drove him away from Eastern Europe and oppressed his people. Tenenbaum, a German Jew who actually helped the infamous Nazi Dr. Josef Mengele with his terrible experiments on prisoners in the concentration camps, also ends up aping her oppressors. She brings Mengele's horrific methods, especially those used on children, to Rapture, producing the little sisters in the process," unquote. The author is essentially blaming Tenenbaum's behavior on the Germans, rather than entertaining the idea that Tenenbaum was perhaps as evil as her oppressors. More importantly, I want to highlight who Andrew Ryan was fleeing in Eastern Europe. The Bolshevik Revolution was primarily orchestrated, designed, and financed by his fellow Jews, not Gentiles. Ryan was literally fleeing persecution from his own people. I don't think it's a coincidence either that all throughout the story of BioShock, Andrew Ryan repeatedly calls everyone parasites. Ryan has internalized and refashioned the Nazi accusation. Rapture is a kind of Jewish fantasy in which stereotypes are reversed, and it is the Gentile feeding off of a Jewish society. The real antagonist in the game is not even Ryan, but rather a Gentile by the name of Fontaine, who in the final battle assumes the form of a kind of warped Nazi Übermensch. And if you think I'm being oversensitive or suffering from confirmation bias, the next BioShock Levine developed was absolutely infested with relentless attacks on race purists and mockings of the religious reverence Americans display for their founding fathers.
Comstock is the god of the white man, the rich man, the pitiless man. But if you believe in common folk, then join the Fox.
At the end of the game, it is revealed that the white protagonist, Booker DeWitt, is himself the arch-villain Comstock, and that the only way to stop the vicious cycle of violence is to kill himself. Columbia is a proxy for white America, and the point of the story is that no matter what path DeWitt chooses, he can't avoid doing wrong. White America is rotten to its core. White men are rotten to their core, and the world would be better off without them. Ryan Lazardi, a professor of digital media design at SUNY Polytechnic who has heavily examined the themes of BioShock, said in the article that, quote, "The big thesis of BioShock is that history is cyclical and that there's going to be these extremist views that are going to attempt to reinvent and refashion society in whatever vision they see fit," unquote. This is important, as Ken Levine at one point in the article says, quote, There's literal displacement, and then there's a feeling of not fitting in, of I don't really belong here. I think Jews are always going to feel a little bit like they don't belong wherever they are. There's always that what if we have to flee mentality, unquote. Well, as the Zionist author Maurice Samuel said in his 1924 book, You Gentiles, quote, "You and we may come to an understanding, never to a reconciliation. There will always be irritation between us as long as we are in intimate contact. For nature and constitution and vision divide us from all of you forever. Not a mere conviction, not a mere language, not a mere difference of national or religious allegiance. With the best will on both sides, successful adaptation to each other will always be insecure and transient. Waves of liberality may affect our mutual relationship from time to time. We shall delude ourselves, you and we, with the belief that we have bridged the gulf. Many will pass their lives in that delusion. But as has come to pass so often, the difference which is deeper than will, deeper than consciousness, will assert itself. There is a limit to our moral and mental possibilities. We cannot climb out of ourselves. The complete and permanent reconciliation of your way of life with ours is beyond that limit," unquote. What have we seen since the end of World War II, if not another wave of liberality? Are we not deluding ourselves again? Jews today are constantly citing the rise of anti-Semitism, and yet they never seem to recall that this is a historical pattern. They think that through enough concerted effort they can simply beat the anti-Semitism out of the masses. But what if anti-Semitism is simply the inevitable rejection of Jewish power and influence over non-Jews? As Herodotus said in his attempt to analyze the hostilities between Persians and Greeks, quote, "If anyone, no matter who, were given the opportunity of choosing from amongst all the nations in the world the set of beliefs which he thought best, he would inevitably, after careful considerations of their relative merits, choose that of his own country. Everyone, without exception, believes his own native customs and the religion he was brought up in to be the best. And that being so, it is unlikely that anyone but a madman would mock at such things. There is abundant evidence that this is the universal feeling about the ancient customs of one's country," unquote. With this in mind, I ask today's Jews, in what country is there a place for people like me? In their perpetual fear of anti-Semitism, it would appear that they have destroyed much of the social fabric and identity of Europeans because essentially, our identity makes them uncomfortable. In an article written in 2001 entitled "The Jewish Stake in America's Changing Demography," Dr. Stephen Steinlein criticizes the anti-immigrant xenophobic attitudes toward foreigners of white Christian Americans, and yet he goes on to ask if large-scale non-European immigration is good for Jews. Speaking to the dogmatic Jewish American refusal to address immigration reform, he says, quote, "Not far down the list of awful consequences, our unspoken acquiescence leaves the anti-determinist camp, with some notable exceptions, largely in the hands of classic anti-immigrant, xenophobic, and racist nativist forces. The white Christian supremacists, who have historically opposed either all immigration or all non-European immigration, a position reasserted by Peter Brimelow, must not be permitted to play a prominent role in the debate over the way America responds to unprecedented demographic change," unquote. He later contemplates the consequences of unchecked mass migration for Jews. Quote, "Is the emerging new multicultural American nation good for the Jews? Will a country in which enormous demographic and cultural change, fueled by unceasing large-scale non-European immigration, remain one in which Jewish life will continue to flourish as nowhere else in the history of the diaspora? In an America in which people of color form the plurality, as has already happened in California, most with little or no historical experience with or knowledge of Jews, will Jewish sensitivities continue to enjoy extraordinarily high levels of deference, and will Jewish interests continue to receive special protection? Does it matter that the majority non-European immigrants have no historical experience of the Holocaust or knowledge of the persecution of Jews over the ages, and sees Jews only as the most privileged and powerful of white Americans," unquote. This is moral particularism at its finest. Steinlein condemns white Americans for considering and wanting the very same things that he now wants Jews to consider. Moreover, the Jewish establishment has waged a century-long culture war against the founding white Anglo-Saxon Protestant in order to create more favorable conditions for their people. I do not think this was done for my mutual advancement. I think this was done at my expense. So forgive me if I don't consider prominent Jews today, such as Ben Shapiro and Dennis Prager, to be working toward my mutual advancement now that they want immigration reform. To them, I appear to be nothing more than part of a giant demographic pool, the contents of which must be carefully regulated for maximum Jewish benefit. Too many white people could mean nationalism, or populism, or worse yet, Nazism, but too few white people would mean the country would never bow to Jewish interests like it has in the past. I suspect that one of the only reasons the IQ debate has been allowed to take root as much as it has recently is because, when carefully presented, it works in the favor of Jewish interests. Now, I don't doubt for a moment that there is some diversity of opinion among Jews in America. The problem, however, as I see it, is that they see everything in terms of what's good and what's not good for Jews, and I'm not Jewish. In 1920, Winston Churchill wrote in the Sunday Herald, quote, "The struggle which is now beginning between the Zionist and Bolshevik Jews is little less than a struggle for the soul of the Jewish people," unquote. Churchill highlights a major concern I have, which is that if Jews are smarter than us, well, God bless them, but why does that obligate me to participate in the battle for their soul? As the first century Jewish philosopher Hillel once said, "If I am not for myself, then who will be for me? But when I am for myself, then what am I? And if not now, when?"